Hollywood will give you dragons, aliens, and time travel. But black pharaohs? Suddenly, that's unrealistic. They'll spend hundreds of millions recreating ancient Egypt, pyramids, gold, gods, rituals, then erase the very people who built it, not by accident, by design. Egypt is one of the most filmed civilizations on Earth, yet when the camera rolls, the faces never match the history. The skin lightens, the features soften, the truth disappears. That's the contradiction. Hollywood loves Egypt. Hollywood avoids black Egyptians. Why? Ancient Egypt wasn't a footnote civilization, it was a superpower. Science, medicine, architecture, astronomy, governance. Egypt laid foundations the world still stands on. And for thousands of years, the rulers of that empire were African, not ambiguous, not Mediterranean. African. We're talking about dynasties that ruled longer than Rome ever existed. Pharaohs whose statues, reliefs, and inscriptions show unmistakable African features. Skin tones painted dark red-brown for men, deep brown for women. Hair braided, locked, wrapped, lips full, noses broad. This wasn't symbolic art. Egyptian art followed strict rules. Pharaohs were depicted as they were meant to be remembered. Power demanded accuracy. Yet Hollywood acts like this creates a problem, because if black Africans ruled the most advanced civilization of the ancient world, then the entire modern hierarchy starts to wobble. The idea that Africa contributed little collapses. The myth of Europe as the sole engine of civilization starts to look fragile. So the struggle isn't about casting, it's about control of legacy. Here's the shift Hollywood never talks about. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European empires expanded across Africa, they needed a story where Africa was primitive, waiting to be discovered, a story where greatness flowed into Africa, not out of it. Ancient Egypt broke that story, so Egypt had to be separated from Africa, culturally, racially, psychologically. Scholars began rebranding Egypt as Near Eastern, Mediterranean, or vaguely non-black. Museums rearranged exhibits. Textbooks softened language. Art was selectively framed. Hollywood inherited that framework. Film studios don't create history from scratch. They recycle what's already been sanitized. By the time Egypt reaches the screen, the decision has already been made. Blackness must be minimized. This isn't conspiracy, it's pipeline bias. Once an idea enters institutions, it reproduces itself. So now we live in a world where fantasy gets more respect than African history. A dragon can be realistic. A black pharaoh is controversial. And here's the twist that makes people uncomfortable. Hollywood doesn't avoid black pharaohs because there's no evidence. Hollywood avoids them because the evidence is too strong. Because once audiences see African kings ruling Egypt confidently, intelligently, unapologetically, the spell breaks. Questions start forming. Timelines shift. Pride returns where it was never supposed to. This isn't about the past. It's about who gets to imagine themselves as builders of civilization. And Hollywood knows exactly what it's doing. Hollywood loves to pretend casting is neutral, talent-based, market-driven, innocent. That's the lie. Casting is one of the most powerful storytelling weapons ever invented. Whoever you put on screen doesn't just play history, they become history in the public mind. Faces repeat, images harden, memory forms, and Hollywood understands that better than anyone. So when it comes to Egypt, casting isn't about accuracy, it's about risk management. Because the moment you cast a clearly black pharaoh, you're not just telling a story, you're challenging a hierarchy that's been quietly reinforced for over a century. Studios don't fear backlash, they fear disruption. A black pharaoh doesn't just change a movie, it changes the conversation. Now suddenly people are asking questions they were never supposed to ask. Why don't our textbooks look like this? Why did museums frame it differently? Why were African achievements minimized everywhere else? That's not entertainment anymore. That's liability. So Hollywood sticks to a safer formula, ambiguity. Brown enough to feel exotic, light enough to feel familiar, never too African, never too clear, because clarity is dangerous. And here's where the economics come in. Hollywood claims black-led historical epics don't sell internationally. That myth gets repeated like gospel, but notice how selective that logic is. They'll gamble on obscure European kings nobody remembers. They'll finance Viking sagas, medieval nobles, Roman senators with zero global recognition. But a black pharaoh? Suddenly they're nervous. Why? Because the global market they're protecting isn't about ticket sales. It's about ideological comfort. Western audiences have been trained to associate power, intellect, and ancient authority with whiteness or near whiteness. A black ruler in the ancient world forces a mental rewrite, and rewrites cause resistance. So studios choose the path of least resistance, not truth, not evidence, familiar illusions. And let's be real, Hollywood doesn't just reflect society, it trains it. Decades of casting choices have conditioned audiences to see blackness in certain lanes: athlete, sidekick, victim, rebel, comic relief, modern struggle, ancient mastery. That lane stays closed, not because black actors can't carry it, but because the image disrupts a story Hollywood has been telling itself for generations. Here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. When black people are placed too far back in time, ruling, building, innovating, it breaks the narrative that progress flows only one direction. It exposes the truth that decline, theft, and rewriting are part of history too, and that truth makes institutions uncomfortable. So Hollywood avoids it by reframing Egypt as everyone's civilization, which sounds inclusive until you realize it erases the people who were actually there. Universalizing Egypt strips it of its African identity. And once it's stripped, it's safe. Safe to market, safe to package, safe to sell without consequences. That's why you see black extras but rarely black kings. Labor without authority, presence without power. It's subtle, but it's consistent. And consistency is how propaganda works. Now zoom out for a second. Hollywood isn't operating alone. It's plugged into museums, academic traditions, publishing houses, and old European narratives that already decided Egypt needed to be racially neutralized. Film is just the final delivery system. By the time a script reaches casting, the damage is already done. The pharaoh has been rewritten on the page, described with coded language: olive, bronze, ambiguous, never African, never specific, because specificity forces accountability, and accountability forces change. Here's the irony. The same industry that prides itself on representation panics when representation goes too far back in time. Modern stories are safe. Historical ones are dangerous. Why? Because modern success can be framed as exception. Ancient success looks like origin, and origins matter. If Africa is shown as foundational instead of peripheral, then the entire worldview shifts. Suddenly, black excellence isn't new, it's inherited. And that's the real fear. Not anger, not outrage, not box office numbers. Inheritance. So Hollywood plays dumb, claims ignorance, blames tradition. But tradition is just a habit that never got challenged, until now. Because the question isn't whether black pharaohs existed. The question is why an industry built on imagination refuses to imagine them. And what else collapses once that door finally opens? So ask yourself, if casting is never neutral and history is never accidental, what happens when the screen finally tells the truth? Let's kill the biggest excuse right now. Hollywood doesn't avoid black pharaohs because the evidence is unclear. The evidence is overwhelming. Statues, reliefs, wall paintings, tomb inscriptions, ancient descriptions, DNA debates they keep dodging. The material is so dense that historians have been arguing not if Egypt was African, but how much modern politics interfered with admitting it. The problem was never proof. The problem was exposure. Because once the evidence becomes visual and unavoidable, the debate ends. Film doesn't argue. Film shows. And once something is shown enough times, it becomes real in the public mind. That's why Hollywood hesitates. Museums can hide artifacts behind glass. Textbooks can soften language. But a 2-hour movie burns images into memory. And memory is power. Take Egyptian art. This isn't abstract symbolism like modern art. Egyptian artists followed strict racial codes. Men painted dark red-brown, women lighter brown, Nubians painted darker, Libyans lighter, Asians yellowish. They differentiated intentionally. That means when you see dark-skinned rulers carved into stone again and again, that's not artistic flair, that's identity. But Hollywood avoids that clarity, because clarity forces alignment. Either you accept Africa as central to civilization, or you admit the story you were told was incomplete. And incomplete stories make people angry. Here's what really scared early scholars, and still scares studios now. Egypt didn't rise in isolation. It rose alongside Nubia, Kush, Punt, Taseti, regions that were unapologetically African. Trade flowed south to north long before Europe mattered. Pharaohs married Nubian queens. Dynasties ruled from the south. This means black rule in Egypt wasn't an exception. It was normal. That alone dismantles centuries of racial hierarchy. So instead of confronting it, the story was reframed. Egypt was lifted out of Africa and placed into a fictional racial limbo. Not white, not black, just ancient. That limbo is Hollywood's comfort zone, because ancient but not black allows admiration without consequences. You can praise the pyramids without honoring the people. You can worship the civilization without empowering its descendants. That's the trick. Now look at what Hollywood does with other histories. When Rome is depicted, they exaggerate whiteness. When Greece is shown, they bathe it in marble and pale sunlight. Accuracy suddenly becomes flexible. But when it comes to Africa, flexibility disappears. Suddenly, they demand consensus, debate, scholarly caution. Funny how caution only shows up when blackness enters the frame. And here's the psychological layer nobody likes to admit. If black people ruled Egypt, the most admired ancient civilization, then modern racism isn't ignorance, it's denial. It means people knew better and chose differently. That's not a comfortable realization. So Hollywood keeps Egypt safely abstract. Pharaohs become symbols, not ancestors, voices with accents, bodies without lineage, and the audience absorbs it quietly, because repetition works. After decades of pale pharaohs on screen, the image feels normal. Anything else feels like revision, even when it's correction. That's how deep the conditioning runs. Now here's the irony. Hollywood will celebrate diversity in fantasy worlds that never existed. Dragons of every shade, kingdoms with impossible physics, magic systems pulled out of thin air. But real African history? Too risky, because fantasy doesn't threaten identity. Reality does. A black pharaoh isn't just a character, he's a mirror. He reflects questions about who built what, who taught whom, and who later claimed ownership. That reflection unsettles people who have been positioned as inheritors of greatness. So instead of dealing with discomfort, Hollywood dodges it. They'll say audiences aren't ready, but audiences adapt fast. What they really mean is institutions aren't ready, because once the visual truth becomes mainstream, the follow-up questions are unstoppable. If Egypt was African, what about Greece? If Africa taught mathematics and philosophy, who borrowed it? If black people ruled advanced societies before Europe rose, what does that say about modern narratives of superiority? Those questions don't stay in the theater. They leak into classrooms, conversations, identity. And that's why visibility is the real threat. Not facts, not evidence, not archaeology, visibility. So Hollywood keeps the curtain half closed, enough Egypt to fascinate, not enough to awaken. But history has a habit of pushing back, and the more they avoid showing black pharaohs, the louder the silence becomes. So the real question isn't whether Hollywood knows the truth. It's how long they think they can keep hiding it, before the audience starts demanding to see what's been off-screen the whole time. Every empire survives on an origin story, not just how it began, but who gets credit for beginning everything. Hollywood is deeply invested in protecting that story, because once you show black pharaohs clearly, confidently, repeatedly, you're not just correcting Egypt, you're threatening the entire timeline that props up Western identity. Here's the quiet fear. If Egypt was ruled by black Africans, then Greece didn't invent civilization, it inherited it. Philosophy, mathematics, medicine, architecture, astronomy, All of it suddenly has a preface nobody wanted read aloud, and Hollywood understands how dangerous prefaces are. They change how the main story feels. That's why ancient Greece is always framed as the birthplace of reason, because births imply originality. But Egypt was already old when Greece was young. Greek thinkers studied there, trained there, copied there. That's not opinion. That's historical record. But Hollywood doesn't show Greece learning. It shows Greece inventing, because invention feels heroic. Learning feels dependent. Now imagine what happens when audiences see African kings ruling Egypt centuries before Greek democracy ever existed. The ladder flips. Europe stops looking like the starting point. Africa starts looking like the foundation. And foundations don't ask permission. That's the rewrite Hollywood wants to avoid, because once Africa is acknowledged as foundational, modern power hierarchies start looking artificial, not natural, not inevitable. Artificial hierarchies need constant maintenance, so the safest move is omission, not denial. Omission. They don't argue black pharaohs didn't exist, they just don't show them. Silence is cleaner than conflict, and it works until people notice the gap. Now let's talk psychology. People protect their identity more fiercely than facts. If a piece of history threatens how someone understands their place in the world, the brain doesn't analyze it. It resists it. Hollywood knows this. A black pharaoh forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the story of progress they absorbed was selective. And selective stories feel like betrayal once exposed. Nobody likes realizing they were trained, not taught. So, studios avoid lighting that fuse. They choose narratives that preserve emotional stability for the dominant audience. That's not accidental. It's strategic. And here's where it gets darker. When you erase black rulers from antiquity, you don't just erase pride, you erase precedent. Without precedent, modern inequality looks like destiny, like coincidence, like culture. But with precedent, it looks like disruption. It looks like something was taken. That realization shifts blame, and blame always makes people defensive. Hollywood prefers nostalgia over reckoning. That's why ancient stories are framed as distant, mythic, disconnected. The farther away they feel, the less responsibility they carry. But black pharaohs collapse distance. They connect Africa directly to the roots of global civilization, and connection demands accountability. Now watch how this plays out on screen. Egypt is depicted as mystical, magical, spiritual, but not intellectual. Pyramids appear like miracles, not engineering feats. Knowledge becomes mystery instead of mastery. That framing is deliberate. Mystery doesn't require acknowledging competence. Competence implies capability, and capability raises questions. So Hollywood leans into spectacle and avoids substance. Gold masks, curses, afterlife, but never governance, never administration, never systems, because systems prove intelligence. And intelligence destroys stereotypes. Now flip it. When European civilizations are portrayed, the focus is on systems, law, strategy, philosophy, governance. Even when they're brutal, they're framed as organized. That contrast isn't neutral. It trains the audience to associate intellect with whiteness and mysticism with Africa. And that's why showing black pharaohs fully, ruling, thinking, building, disrupts more than aesthetics. It disrupts conditioning. So Hollywood chooses safety. They'll say it's about storytelling clarity. But clarity is exactly what they're avoiding, because clarity would force a reckoning with the fact that modern narratives weren't just incomplete. They were curated. And curated stories serve someone. Here's the twist. Hollywood fears rewriting the origin story because once it changes, it can't be controlled. People start revisiting everything: art, religion, science, politics. You can't contain curiosity once. It's activated. And curiosity leads to questions like, if Africa was central, not peripheral, if black people weren't late to history, but early to it, if civilization didn't flow one direction, then who decided the story we all learned? And why? That's the moment Hollywood wants to delay as long as possible. But the cracks are showing, and the more they avoid black pharaohs, the clearer it becomes that something powerful is being protected. So the real issue isn't whether Hollywood can tell the story. It's whether they're ready to lose control once the origin story changes forever. Hollywood doesn't just tell stories, it trains eyesight. What you see first becomes what you believe longest. That's why the battle over Black Pharaohs is really a battle over images, not facts, not footnotes, images. Because images bypass logic and go straight to instinct. You can read 10 books about African Egypt, but one movie with a pale pharaoh will overwrite it, emotionally. That's how the brain works. Visual dominance, repetition, authority. Hollywood knows this. It's why they invest so heavily in iconic looks, why superheroes wear specific colors, why villains have coded features, why heroes are framed in light. Egypt is one of the most powerful visual brands on earth. Pyramids, crowns, gold, gods, eternity. Whoever controls that imagery controls the subconscious association with power, and power is not something institutions like to redistribute. So Hollywood wages a quiet image war, not by openly saying Egypt wasn't black, but by flooding the screen with alternatives. Light-skinned pharaohs, racially vague queens, African extras in the background, European leads in the center. It's subtle enough to deny, consistent enough to work. After decades of this, audiences don't question it. The image feels right. Anything else feels forced, even when it's accurate. That's psychological conditioning. And once conditioning sets in, correction feels like attack. Now look at how resistance is framed. Whenever black pharaohs are suggested, the pushback isn't scholarly, it's emotional. People say things like, "Why does race matter?" Or, "Why make everything about identity?" That response is revealing, because race only doesn't matter when it threatens existing hierarchies. When whiteness is centered, it's invisible. When blackness is centered, it's political. Hollywood exploits that reflex. By keeping Egypt racially ambiguous, they avoid triggering defensiveness in mainstream audiences. But the cost is historical honesty, and honesty has never been the priority. Now here's the deeper layer. Hollywood isn't just worried about white audiences, it's worried about black audiences waking up to visual inheritance. Because once you see your ancestors ruling the most admired ancient civilization, your relationship with the present changes. Confidence shifts. Expectations rise. The mental ceiling cracks. That's dangerous to systems built on managed ambition. So the images stay controlled. Egypt remains exotic but disconnected, powerful but ownerless, a civilization without heirs. And when a civilization has no heirs, nobody can reclaim it. That's the trick. Now think about how often black people are shown as originators of anything ancient. Rarely. When it happens, it's framed as an exception, a mystery, or a debate, never a baseline. But baselines shape self-perception. If greatness starts elsewhere, then catching up feels natural. If greatness starts with you, then exclusion feels deliberate. Hollywood avoids that realization, so the image war continues. Every pale statue on screen reinforces a hierarchy. Every ambiguous casting choice delays a reckoning. Every omission trains another generation to misremember, and misremembering is powerful. People will defend memories they never verified. Now here's what really exposes the game. When Hollywood does show black ancient rulers in fantasy, alternate timelines, or fictional kingdoms, audiences accept it instantly. No outrage, no confusion, no panic, which proves the resistance isn't about visuals, it's about history. Fantasy doesn't threaten lineage, history does, because history comes with receipts, and receipts raise questions nobody wants trending. Questions like, who decided these images in the first place? Who benefited from whitening antiquity? And who lost identity along the way? Hollywood doesn't answer those questions. It distracts from them. More remakes, more spectacles, more noise. But silence around black pharaohs gets louder every year, because once people notice the pattern, they can't unsee it. And once the image war is recognized, the next step is confrontation, not with anger, with demand. Demand for accuracy, demand for representation rooted in evidence, demand for stories that don't flinch, And that's the moment Hollywood is really afraid of. Because when audiences start asking why certain images were avoided, the conversation stops being about casting and starts being about control. So ask yourself, if images shape belief and belief shapes identity, what happens when the images finally change? Before Hollywood ever touched Egypt, academia had already made its move. In the 1800s and early 1900s, European scholars flooded Egypt with measuring tools, sketchbooks, and preloaded assumptions. They weren't just studying ruins, they were sorting humanity. Skulls measured, features categorized, civilizations ranked, and Egypt became a problem because the artifacts didn't match the hierarchy they were trying to build. So scholars created distance, linguistic distance, cultural distance, racial distance. Egypt was slowly peeled away from Africa and repositioned closer to Europe and the Near East. Not because the evidence demanded it, but because ideology did. Hollywood inherited this academic framing wholesale. By the time film studios started adapting ancient stories, the groundwork was already laid. Egypt had been academically laundered, safe enough to admire, distant enough to claim. So, when Hollywood tells you it's just following scholarship, that's only half true. It's following old scholarship, frozen in time because updating it would cause friction. And friction costs money. Here's the part most people miss. Academia quietly began correcting itself decades ago. New archaeological interpretations, reassessments of Nubian dynasties, acknowledgement of African continuity. But those updates stayed locked in journals, conferences, and footnotes. Hollywood never picked them up because correction doesn't sell as smoothly as continuity. Changing the image of Egypt would require explaining why it changed, and explanations lead to uncomfortable admissions about past distortions. So, Hollywood sticks with the outdated version, not because it's accurate, because it's convenient. And convenience always beats truth in mass media. Now look at how academic uncertainty is weaponized. Anytime black pharaohs are mentioned, critics rush in with phrases like debated, complex, or not settled, as if history requires unanimity before it can be visualized. But that standard is never applied elsewhere. Hollywood portrays ancient battles with invented dialogue, Roman generals with modern accents, Greek philosophers speaking English. Nobody demands peer-reviewed certainty there, but introduce black African rulers, and suddenly everyone wants footnotes. That double standard exposes the fear, because debate can be used as delay. Delay can be used as denial, so Hollywood waits, and waits, and waits. Meanwhile, the old images keep circulating. Here's the quiet damage. When outdated academic models dominate pop culture, they outlive their correction. Generations absorb false baselines while the truth stays trapped in specialist circles. That's how misinformation becomes tradition, and tradition becomes identity. Now consider this. If Hollywood updated Egypt to reflect modern scholarship, it wouldn't just affect one genre, it would ripple through everything connected to antiquity. Biblical films, Greek epics, Roman origin stories, Western intellectual lineage. Suddenly the family tree looks different, and people don't like discovering their roots were grafted, so instead of updating, Hollywood freezes Egypt in a racial gray zone and moves on. Now here's the twist. Academia may have opened the door, but Hollywood slammed it shut because film reaches where journals can't. A revised paper might influence a classroom. A movie influences millions. That scale terrifies institutions built on narrative stability. So Hollywood pretends neutrality while reinforcing the status quo. And neutrality is never neutral. It always sides with whoever already benefits. Now watch how this plays out when new projects are pitched. Writers propose black-led Egypt stories. Studios respond with audience confusion, global market concerns, creative differences. Those are code words. They mean this disrupts too much. So projects die quietly, scripts shelved, stories never told, and the absence becomes invisible. No outrage, no protest, just silence. But silence is the loudest signal of all. Because when a story is avoided consistently, it's usually not because it lacks merit, but because it has power. power to challenge, power to reframe, power to undo decades of conditioning. And Hollywood doesn't undo conditioning, it monetizes it. So the pipeline stays clogged. New scholarship doesn't reach the screen. Old myths keep getting sequels. And audiences assume that's just how it was. But it wasn't. And the longer Hollywood delays updating Egypt, the more obvious the avoidance becomes, which leads to the real question. If academia is slowly correcting the record and audiences are increasingly curious, how long can Hollywood keep pretending it doesn't see what's already in plain sight? Hollywood doesn't move on truth. It moves on pressure, political pressure, financial pressure, cultural pressure. And Egypt sits right at the intersection of all three. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because the avoidance of black pharaohs isn't just cultural inertia. It's actively maintained by interests that benefit from keeping certain narratives untouched. Let's start with money. Big budget historical films don't get made without international financing. Co-productions, distribution partners, foreign markets, cultural ministries, tourism boards. Egyptian history isn't just history, it's branding. Modern nation-states have invested heavily in presenting Egypt as a universal heritage site, not an African one. Neutral, timeless, detached from race, safe for global consumption. That branding feeds tourism, diplomacy, and soft power. Now imagine a Hollywood blockbuster that clearly frames ancient Egypt as a black African civilization. Visually, unapologetically, repeatedly. That doesn't just rewrite history, it rewrites branding. And branding disputes get political fast, so studios anticipate resistance before it even happens. They self-censor, they adjust scripts, they smooth edges, not because anyone explicitly tells them don't do it, but because they know where the lines are, and crossing lines costs access. Now add donors and cultural institutions into the mix. Museums, foundations, academic sponsors, many of them tied to old European prestige, have long-standing relationships with Hollywood consultants, advisors who shape authenticity, historians who get called in to bless scripts. Those consultants often come from traditions that already distanced Egypt from black Africa, so the same perspectives get recycled. Hollywood loves experts, especially when those experts confirm what's already comfortable. And when dissenting scholars speak up, they're labeled controversial, fringe, or political. Funny how political always means inconvenient. Now let's talk geopolitics. Africa's historical narrative has always been managed externally. Colonization didn't just extract resources, it extracted authorship. Europeans wrote African history through their own lens, then exported it as neutral truth. Hollywood inherited that lens. So when African-centered narratives challenge it, the pushback isn't loud, it's procedural. Funding disappears, meetings stall, executives hesitate. No villain, just blockage. And blockage is effective. Now here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Hollywood avoids black pharaohs because modern racial politics are already volatile. Studios fear being accused of revisionism, not because it's wrong, but because it invites scrutiny. Scrutiny opens archives. Archives expose inconsistencies. Inconsistencies raise questions, and questions spiral. Questions about why certain images dominated for so long. Questions about who benefited. Questions about whose voices were excluded. Hollywood prefers clean narratives, messy truths, slow production. Now look at how outrage is anticipated. Executives imagine backlash headlines before scripts are approved. They picture think pieces, debates, boycotts, not just from conservatives, but from academics, pundits, and international partners. And instead of standing firm, they choose avoidance, because avoidance doesn't make noise. This is how power operates in modern media, not through bans, through hesitation. Now consider the irony. Hollywood constantly claims to push boundaries, to challenge norms, to start conversations, but those conversations always stop, short of origins. They'll talk about inequality now. They'll dramatize injustice later. But ancient black sovereignty, that's a line they won't cross, because ancient sovereignty rewrites legitimacy, and legitimacy is political currency. Now let's flip the lens. When non-black civilizations are centered, nobody asks whose politics are being served. But when black civilizations are centered, suddenly everything is political. That tells you exactly where power sits. Neutrality is a privilege of dominance, so Hollywood hides behind it. And here's the most revealing part. When black creatives pitch these stories, they're often told to modernize them, add relatable struggles, focus on oppression, make it accessible. Translation: don't show uninterrupted power, because uninterrupted black power makes people uncomfortable. So stories get reshaped, kings become conflicted, empires become fragile, success becomes temporary, but European empires, they get to be monumental. That contrast isn't accidental, it's curated. So Hollywood stays trapped between truth and convenience wins until pressure flips. And pressure is flipping. Audiences are smarter, more connected, less passive. People are comparing notes, digging deeper, asking why the screen never matches the artifacts. And once that curiosity hits a critical mass, avoidance stops working. Because silence stops feeling neutral, it starts feeling guilty. So here's the real tension building behind the scenes. Hollywood knows the story is changing. It just doesn't know how to change without admitting it was wrong. And that's the cliff. Because the longer they wait, the louder the correction will be when it finally comes. So the question isn't whether Hollywood will tell the truth about black pharaohs. It's whether it will lead the shift or get dragged into it kicking and screaming. Whenever Hollywood gets cornered on this topic, one excuse always comes out. The audience isn't ready. That phrase sounds thoughtful, responsible, even progressive. It's none of those things. It's a shield. Audiences don't resist truth. They resist sudden contradictions to what they were trained to believe. And that training didn't come from the audience. It came from institutions. Hollywood helped build the conditioning, then blames the condition for needing time. That's backwards. History shows audiences adapt fast when stories are told confidently. What confuses people isn't new information. It's uncertainty in how it's presented. And Hollywood specializes in certainty. When studios commit to a narrative, audiences follow. No hand-holding, no disclaimers, no apologies. But when it comes to black pharaohs, Hollywood hesitates. And hesitation signals doubt. Doubt invites backlash. So instead of owning the story, studios float half measures, test scenes, ambiguous casting, blink and you miss it references. Then they point to mixed reactions as proof the audience isn't ready. That's manipulation. Now look at how other historical corrections were handled. When films shifted portrayals of Vikings, medieval Europe, or ancient Rome, audiences adjusted. When new interpretations emerged, they became mainstream quickly because they were presented as normal, not debated, not apologized for, normalized. The difference is those corrections didn't challenge racial hierarchy. A black pharaoh does. So Hollywood pretends the issue is timing, not fear. Here's what they really mean by not ready. They mean some viewers might feel destabilized, and destabilization is the point of truth. But Hollywood isn't in the business of destabilizing its core audience. It's in the business of soothing it. That's why challenging narratives are outsourced to documentaries, niche platforms, or independent films, safely away from blockbuster. Visibility. Big screens stay safe. Now let's talk about global audiences. Hollywood often claims international markets won't accept black-led ancient epics. That argument collapses the moment you look at actual viewing behavior. Global audiences consume black-led content all the time when it's positioned with confidence, music, sports, action films, fantasy franchises. What they resist isn't blackness. It's contradiction to what they were previously told by Western media. Hollywood trained global audiences too. So again, the issue isn't readiness, it's responsibility. If you taught a lie long enough, correction feels like disruption, but disruption is not the audience's fault. Now here's the quiet truth. Hollywood fears that once black pharaohs are normalized, the follow-up demand won't stop there. Audiences will ask for black philosophers, black mathematicians, black navigators, black architects of global systems, and Hollywood knows it. Doesn't have a clean answer ready. So it delays the first domino, because once it falls, The rest can't be controlled. Now watch how the readiness myth collapses in real time. Whenever accurate depictions do appear in documentaries, museum exhibitions, or independent media, the reaction isn't confusion, it's curiosity. People lean in, they research, they discuss. Confusion only happens when institutions act unsure. Confidence sets the tone. Hollywood knows this, which means the audience readiness argument isn't ignorance, it's strategy. And strategies always serve someone. Now here's the twist. The audience Hollywood claims to protect is changing faster than the industry itself. Younger viewers don't have the same emotional investment in outdated hierarchies. They question images instinctively. They Google, they cross-check, they notice patterns. And when institutions lag behind audiences, credibility erodes. That's already happening. Every time a pale pharaoh hits the screen, it sparks debate instead of acceptance. The old image no longer lands quietly, which means the safe option isn't safe anymore. Hollywood's delay is starting to cost trust, and trust is harder to rebuild than narratives. So the real risk isn't showing black pharaohs. The real risk is continuing to avoid them while pretending neutrality, because avoidance now reads as intention, and intention invites accountability. So ask yourself this: if audiences are more curious than ever, if scholarship has evolved, if visual evidence is overwhelming, who exactly is still not ready? And what happens when the audience stops waiting for Hollywood's permission to see the truth? This is the part Hollywood never says out loud. Black pharaohs don't just challenge white supremacy, they destabilize internalized limits. Because representation isn't about pride, it's about permission. When people see their ancestors only as victims, survivors, or late arrivals, it quietly caps what feels possible. Aspiration narrows, imagination shrinks. But when you see your ancestors as rulers of the most sophisticated civilization of the ancient world, something snaps back into place, and Hollywood knows that. That's why this avoidance isn't accidental. It's psychological management. A black pharaoh isn't just a historical correction. He's a counter-programming force. He interrupts centuries of imagery that position blackness as reactive instead of generative. Reactive people respond. Generative people originate. Origins change self-perception, and self-perception changes behavior. That's dangerous to systems that rely on predictability. Now think about how black excellence is usually framed on screen: athletic dominance, musical genius, cultural influence, all real, all powerful, but rarely ancient, rarely foundational, because modern success can be framed as anomaly, as talent, as luck, as hustle. Ancient sovereignty can't. Ancient sovereignty says we were always capable, and that demolishes the lie that progress had to arrive from elsewhere. Hollywood avoids black pharaohs because they activate a memory deeper than education: ancestral recognition. You don't need to be taught how to feel that. You just know. That's why even a glimpse of accurate imagery hits hard. Something resonates before logic kicks in, and resonance spreads. Now here's the part institutions really fear. When black audiences reclaim ancient greatness, it reframes modern struggle, not as cultural failure, but as interruption. Interruption implies theft. Theft implies accountability. So the story has to stay incomplete. Better to show black pain than black continuity. Pain invites sympathy. Continuity invites respect. Hollywood is comfortable with sympathy. It's uncomfortable with respect that can't be negotiated. Now flip the lens. For non-black audiences, seeing black pharaohs forces a reevaluation of inherited superiority narratives. It destabilizes unconscious assumptions about who historically led, taught, and built. That destabilization feels like loss, even when it's just correction. And people resist perceived loss. So Hollywood plays mediator. It keeps everyone emotionally comfortable by never fully committing. But comfort is the enemy of truth. Now consider the generational impact. Young black viewers growing up without images of ancient black mastery internalize a truncated lineage. They're taught resilience, not inheritance; survival, not authorship. That shapes ambition. Hollywood has no problem showing white children or adults inheriting ancient greatness, knights, kings, philosophers, conquerors. But black inheritance is rarely visualized because inheritance creates expectation. Expectation demands opportunity, and opportunity disrupts status quos. Now here's the twist that exposes everything. Hollywood doesn't actually fear black audiences seeing black pharaohs. It fears what comes after, the questions, the research, the reorientation. Because once people start connecting dots, the story of modern inequality stops being abstract. It becomes historical. And historical explanations point to systems, not individuals. That's when conversations shift from what's wrong now to what was taken then. And that's a conversation institutions have been avoiding for centuries, so the omission continues. Not because black pharaohs aren't compelling, but because they're too compelling. They restore dignity without asking permission. They challenge inferiority without shouting. They empower without preaching. An empowerment that doesn't ask is the most threatening kind. So Hollywood keeps the image off screen. But images don't disappear forever. They resurface in independent media, in museums updating quietly, in conversations that don't wait for studios. And once enough people see themselves clearly reflected in the past, the future starts looking negotiable, which raises the final tension. If black identity is rerouted in ancient sovereignty instead of modern struggle, what happens to every narrative that depended on us forgetting that in the first place? Hollywood wants you to believe this silence is stable. It's not. The avoidance of black pharaohs is starting to fail. Not because studios change, but because the world did. Information doesn't move top down anymore. It leaks. It spreads sideways. It bypasses gatekeepers. And once people see enough fragments of truth, the official story starts sounding rehearsed. That's where we are now. Museums quietly update plaques. Curators adjust language. Scholars revise conclusions. Independent creators show what studios won't. And audiences notice the mismatch. They see dark stone statues labeled Mediterranean. They hear ancient descriptions that don't match the casting. They compare reliefs to movie posters. The cracks widen. Hollywood senses it, which is why the pushback is getting louder, not quieter. When silence stops working, ridicule becomes the next defense. People who bring up black pharaohs get labeled agenda-driven, emotional, or online historians. Not wrong, just inconvenient. That's how institutions protect themselves when denial no longer holds. Now look at what's happening culturally. Black-led historical content that bypasses Hollywood is exploding. Podcasts, YouTube documentaries, independent films, digital exhibitions. Not because they're trendy, but because they're filling a vacuum Hollywood created. And vacuums don't stay empty. Audiences don't need permission anymore. They don't need studios to validate curiosity. They're connecting dots on their own, which means Hollywood's leverage is shrinking. The old model depended on control of visibility. That control is slipping. Now here's the irony. Hollywood thinks delaying the truth preserves stability, but delay actually amplifies impact. The longer correction is postponed, the more explosive it becomes when it finally lands, because it won't feel like discovery. It'll feel like exposure, and exposure carries consequences. So studios are stuck. If they move forward now, they admit they avoided it before. If they stay silent, they look complicit. Either way, credibility takes a hit. That's why you're seeing half steps, side characters, background references, blink and you miss it imagery. Not commitment, just deniability. But deniability doesn't hold when the pattern is obvious. And the pattern is obvious now. Now consider this. Hollywood didn't avoid black pharaohs when it didn't matter. It avoided them when it mattered most. When film became the dominant global memory machine. That timing tells you everything. Because once moving images replaced books as the primary way people learned history, controlling those images became critical. And Egypt was too important to leave uncontested. But control always decays. Technology accelerates truth faster than institutions can contain it. And once people realized they were shown a curated version of antiquity, They don't just question Egypt, they question everything else they were shown. That's the domino Hollywood fears, because when one myth collapses, others wobble. Now here's the shift happening quietly behind the scenes. Younger creators inside the industry are pushing, not loudly, strategically. They're planting seeds, pushing for accuracy under the radar, reframing stories in ways that can't be ignored forever. The resistance isn't unified anymore, which means the old guard can't hold the line indefinitely. And once one major production commits, fully, unapologetically, the floodgates open, because after that, the excuse disappears. No more audience readiness, no more market concerns, no more debate, just precedent. And precedent is power, so Hollywood delays, hoping someone else takes the first risk. But risk is already being taken, just not by them. Which leads to the uncomfortable truth. Hollywood didn't avoid Black Pharaohs because the story was weak. It avoided them because the story was strong enough to survive without them. And that's the part that should make them nervous. Because once the truth spreads beyond their control, Hollywood doesn't get to decide how it's told anymore. So the question isn't whether the cracks will widen. They already have. The real question is, when the wall finally breaks, who will audiences trust to tell the story they weren't shown? Notice something strange. Whenever Black Pharaohs come up, the response isn't calm disagreement, it's irritation, mockery, defensive jokes, eye rolls. That reaction tells you everything. People don't get emotional over ideas that feel harmless. They get emotional when something threatens how they see themselves or how they were taught to see the world. Black Pharaohs don't just challenge history, they challenge identity, and identity is protected at all costs. That's why the pushback often sounds irrational. People demand impossible standards of proof. They move goalposts. They pretend nuance only matters in one direction, because logic isn't driving the response. Protection is. Now understand this clearly. If Egypt being African was truly insignificant, there would be no resistance. It would be a trivia update, a footnote correction. Instead, it sparks outrage. Why? Because Egypt occupies a sacred position in Western imagination. It's the bridge between myth and science, between gods and reason, between ancient mystery and modern achievement. Whoever owns Egypt owns legitimacy. So when blackness is reattached to Egypt, it feels like a loss of ownership to people who unconsciously claimed it, and perceived loss triggers emotion. That's not racism in the cartoon sense, it's something deeper, existential discomfort. Because if Africa wasn't always behind, if black people weren't latecomers to greatness, if civilization didn't move in a straight line toward Europe, then a lot of inherited assumptions collapse, and collapse feels like humiliation. So people lash out, they accuse, they dismiss, they ridicule, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implication is strong. Now here's where Hollywood plays a role again. Studios fear emotional backlash more than factual debate. Debate can be managed. Emotion can't. A film that triggers anger becomes a liability. Sponsors get nervous. PR teams panic. Executives retreat. So instead of confronting emotion head on, Hollywood avoids the trigger altogether. That's why the silence persists. But silence doesn't neutralize emotion. It just delays it. And delayed emotion comes back stronger. Now think about this. Black audiences have been emotionally managing historical erasure for generations, watching ancestors disappear on screen. Seeing power always look like someone else. That emotional cost was never considered a problem. But the moment dominant audiences might feel discomfort, everything freezes. That asymmetry tells you whose emotions are prioritized. Now here's the twist. The emotional pushback isn't universal. It's concentrated. Many viewers are actually relieved when they learn the fuller story. It makes sense to them. The resistance comes from those whose identity was tied to exclusivity, and exclusivity is fragile. Once challenged, it can't be unchallenged. That's why the reaction is so intense. Now ask yourself this. Why would a historical correction provoke more anger than modern injustice stories? Because modern injustice can be framed as tragedy without redistribution. Ancient correction implies redistribution of credit. Credit is power, and power never moves quietly. Hollywood knows this. That's why it keeps Black Pharaohs theoretical instead of visual. Theory can be debated forever. Images end debates. Once people see it, they feel it. And feelings reshape belief faster than facts. That's the real fear. Now look at the language used to shut the conversation down. Stop obsessing over race. History is complicated. Why does it matter? Those phrases aren't neutral. They're defensive exits. They appear when someone doesn't want to follow the logic to its conclusion, because the conclusion is uncomfortable. It suggests that modern narratives of superiority weren't just mistaken, they were constructed. And constructed narratives imply intent. Intent implies responsibility. That's the emotional landmine. So Hollywood avoids stepping on it, but landmines don't disappear. They just get mapped, and the map is filling in fast. More people recognize the emotional manipulation now. They see how discomfort is framed as reason to avoid truth. And once that tactic is exposed, it loses power. So here's where we are. The pushback isn't slowing the conversation anymore. It's exposing fear. And fear always signals vulnerability, which leads to the final tension. If the resistance is this emotional, if the silence is this deliberate, if the stakes are this high, what happens when the story finally gets told anyway, and the emotions people try to avoid arrive all at once? Here's the ending. Hollywood keeps trying to postpone. The truth doesn't need permission. It only needs visibility. And once Black Pharaohs are shown clearly, confidently, without apology, the debate collapses. Not because everyone agrees, but because the image becomes normal. That's how power shifts. Quietly, permanently. When the screen finally reflects what the stone has always shown, something irreversible happens. The myth of African absence dissolves. The timeline realigns. The excuses run out. No speeches needed, no arguments required, just presence. That's why Hollywood resisted so hard, because presence doesn't negotiate. Once audiences see African kings ruling Egypt, commanding armies, governing nations, building systems, it rewrites the subconscious map, not just for Black viewers, but for everyone. History stops feeling one-directional. And when history stops feeling one-directional, hierarchy starts looking artificial. That's the real ending. Not outrage, not chaos, normalization. And normalization is what institutions fear most, because once something becomes normal, it can't be unlearned. You can't go back to pale pharaohs without people noticing the lie. You can't erase an image that already settled into memory. That's why Hollywood delayed, because delay was the only defense left. But delay has a shelf life. The generation coming up isn't asking for permission. They're asking for receipts. And the receipts are carved into stone, buried in museums, and quietly acknowledged by scholars. The screen is just late. Now imagine the moment. A major film, big budget, no hedging, no ambiguity. Black pharaohs centered, not explained. African identity shown as fact, not argument. At first there's noise, headlines, think pieces, social media storms. Then something else happens. People adjust, because humans adapt faster than institutions expect. And once adjustment happens, the old resistance looks strange, desperate, outdated. That's how every major historical correction has worked. The fight happens before normalization, not after. Now here's the final twist. Hollywood thinks telling this story would divide audiences. In reality, avoiding it already has. Avoidance breeds mistrust. Silence breeds suspicion. Omission breeds resentment. Truth, even uncomfortable truth, restores credibility. And credibility is what Hollywood is bleeding right now. So the real question isn't whether Black pharaohs will appear on screen. They will. The only question is who gets remembered as brave enough to show them first, and who gets remembered as having hidden them until hiding was no longer possible. Because history doesn't just judge civilizations, it judges storytellers. And storytellers who chose comfort over truth don't age well, so when the screen finally tells the truth, when African kings are shown ruling Egypt without apology, it won't feel revolutionary. It will feel overdue. like something snapping back into place. And the people who always knew, they won't be surprised. They'll just nod and say, "Yeah, we've been telling you." So ask yourself, when that moment comes and the image can't be erased, who benefits from the truth finally being seen, and who spent centuries hoping it never would?